Hi, everybody. Welcome to the latest episode of Vox Vomitus, otherwise known as Word Vomit. With me today is my two beautiful Vox Vomitus vixens, Trisha Mckee, author of the Beyond series, and Allison Martine, author of the Bourbon books. I, of course, am author Jennifer Ann Gordon, author of the Hotel series and the Gothic Horror novel Beautiful, Frightening, and Silent. We are joined today by Bram Stoker award-winning author Julia Fine. Welcome, Julia.
Hi. Thanks for having me.
We do a lot of waving in this show, just so you know. We do release an audio version of this, so every time we do something silly, we're like, I'm waving at the camera. We just kind of dictate
Otherwise,
what we're doing.
It evolves into mime, and we forget that some people are going to be listening to this on podcast and going, what are they doing?
Yeah, I've had people say, what was going on here at this moment, where one of us did something ridiculous, usually me leaning in dramatically to the camera. So, Julia, you are here promoting your brand new book, The Upstairs House. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself and a little bit about that book?
Yeah, so it's The Upstairs House is my second novel. It came out a week and a day ago, came out last Tuesday, and it is about a woman who has just given birth to her first baby and is in that immediate postpartum period. I almost said nightmare, but period. The baby.
You don't say nightmare.
In the hospital, having just given birth to the baby. And her husband goes back to work pretty quickly, and she's alone with this baby, and she starts hearing noises from the upstairs of her condo building. And it turns out that either she's being haunted by the ghost of Margaret Wise Brown, the author of Goodnight Moon and Runaway Bunny, and Margaret's real life lover, Michael Strange, who was an actress, or she is experiencing severe postpartum mood disorder. And the book sort of follows her as she tries to figure out what's going on and how to sort of exorcise these ghosts, and also figure out, how to handle becoming a mother.
I love it. I love the book so much.
Yeah.
I write horror, and though I don't really consider this a horror novel per se, I love the haunting aspect to it. But I think the true horror of it is just the overwhelming exhaustion and panic I feel for your main character all the time. I'm just I'm tired for her. So you did a great job capturing that. I've never had children, but I've had, obviously most of my friends have had children, and they've described very similar things, minus the ghost of, Margaret Brown, and, minus that. Did you write this right after you had your first child?
Pretty soon after. So when my son was born, I was the first of my sort of close circle of friends and family to have a kid. And so I was wildly unprepared for sort of what that postpartum period looked like. I felt like I got a fairly good sort of idea of what pregnancy, even childbirth was, from literature and movies and just sort of general, the way we just talk about it culturally. But I had not really, I just didn't know what to expect, and was totally unprepared for, waking up every 2 hours to nurse a baby, and just how much of myself I would have to give, and how dependent this baby would be, and just sort of what it would mean physically and mentally, to go from sort of being just responsible for myself to having this new baby. And so in that immediate period, I really was not doing any writing. I wasn't doing any reading. I was super overwhelmed and unprepared. But as I got further from it, I started thinking about how, not strange, but how important it was to have literature about that time, and what I would have wanted to have read and what I would want to know. And the more I talked to, as my friends had kids, or as I made friends who had babies of a similar age, a lot of the things we talked about, we went through similar experiences, but while we were going through them, those who didn't have older siblings or friends who had just done it, or people who were willing to sit them down and say, this is what you can expect, brutally honest about how difficult it can be, we thought we were sort of alone in some of these feelings. And so my thought was, if I could write a book about that period that felt authentic and genuine and sort of gave the experience, wasn't necessarily obviously I was not haunted, wasn't my experience.
Not judging. If you had a relationship with Michael Strange, who was a ghost, I wouldn't judge you for that.
I was interested in depicting that in the book. And so that was sort of part of the impetus. And then also, having just had a baby, I was reading a lot of Goodnight Moon to my baby who would not sleep. And they say to get your baby to sleep, they say do sort of have a routine where you do the same thing every night with, like, so you sing the same song and you use the same smelling lotion, and you read the same book. So I read Goodnight Moon, and I just got more and more obsessed with Goodnight Moon and how I just wasn't sick of it. And why wasn't I sick of it? It was my millionth reading. I was still into this book. What was going on? And so I looked up the author, and Margaret Wise Brown was so fascinating. And that immediately I knew, this is my next book, because I felt like she deserved to be sort of memorialized. So a lot of the stuff about her, basically everything about her in the book, is based on her biographies and her letters and sort of her actual life.
Well, reading your book, I did go down the rabbit hole and looked her up as well, because I was like, as somebody who doesn't have children, I've only read Goodnight Moon one time, which is still weird for somebody who has no children to have read it just in a bookstore, like in a Barnes and Noble. It's like, this is pretty good. So I did end up going down the rabbit hole with her, with Michael Strange, and I was wondering, like, what came first, your love for them or the baby? But now it makes more sense.
Yeah, it was the baby. I knew, I was like you. I knew Goodnight Moon, but I really didn't know it well before my son.
And I was going to say, I assumed by the time I had gotten through some of the details that you either had recently had a baby or were right there, like you were the sister of someone, because a lot of the details, I have 3 kids and I've had all of them within the last 10 years. All of those things aren't things you would necessarily read about, but you would experience, from the mesh panties to the ice packs down there. All of those are details that, again, these are things they don't really talk to you about. And it's like almost a secret club where until you have it, no one's going to tell you these things. And then you're going, why did nobody tell me I was going to have a warm squirt bottle that I was going to be rinsing my, TMI, I know. And I guess that's why a lot of people don't do that. And
it's not, though.
About it.
But I thought that was one thing the book did so well, was really capture these things like detail by detail to fill out this experience that it is a short period of time. And probably a lot of us, once it's over, you just kind of let that go because you don't need to hold on to it. But I don't think I've ever read anything that has that kind of account. Like, yes, people have babies in books, but not that immediate postpartum. Now I'm home with a baby and there's nobody watching me. And what do I do now?
Right.
Yeah, it was the details that ground this story into a reality so well. I didn't know about the mesh panties. I didn't know about the ice pack. I was like, that can't possibly be real. I messaged my best friend and she was like, yeah, it's real. And I went, why didn't you tell me? And she said, well, I thought you still might have kids someday. And I was like,
we don't want to scare you from that club.
Yeah, she really did. I didn't know.
Before my son was born, I asked my mother, I said, what do you want to tell me? And she said, I'm not going to tell you anything because it'll just be and I think she had a very difficult, with me personally, she had all sorts of issues. And I had fairly, I had fairly sort of routine labor and delivery for both of my children. I now have 2. But yeah, it's like it's funny because for me, the postpartum stuff was harder than when you're in the hospital and you've got doctors. And well, if you're having a hospital birth, or even if you're having a home birth, you should have somebody.
Somebody should be there.
But if you're in the hospital, as I was, it feels very like, okay, somebody else can handle this. They're telling me what to do. The baby, if the baby cries, like the nurse can come rock the baby. And then all of a sudden you're at home and you're in charge. And so that to me was a lot scarier. But like you said, that's the thing that we don't talk about. We talk a lot about like, you know, oh, are you going to get an epidural? But not, you know, what are you going to do at 4 a.m. when you're falling asleep and your baby's still crying and nobody's there and the pill, you know? So I felt like, yeah, I feel very strongly that these are conversations that should be more in the forefront sort of what not only women, but just like we talk about generally as a society, because so many people have babies and so many people go through this. And if we can depict, you know, all of these other formative experiences that really change people, we should also be talking about this experience, which is just such a drastic physical and emotional transformation, which I think is why it sort of lends itself to sort of a horror-esque novel.
Well, and we talked a lot, Jen and I were going back and forth about, okay, so we were looking at what the categories were on Amazon to see how it was classified. Because when I found out you were coming on, I downloaded the book and started reading. I didn't know what I was getting into at all. And then Jen's like, well, it's horror. And I'm going, this is horror? Okay, I can see where we're going, where some of this being horror. But when you were writing it, did you go, I want to write a horror story or I want to write a thriller? Or did it just become this thing and then someone else told you where to shelve it?
Yeah, I was definitely conscious of sort of some of the horror tropes that I was using. There is sort of, you know, a long tradition of sort of ghosts and possession and haunted houses and poltergeists that I'm accessing there. And I think like the build of the book sort of follows a more traditional horror novel where, you know, the things, it just escalates and escalates and escalates. And then you have, you know, whatever that cathartic, creepy, scary, you know, final moment is. But when I'm writing, don't necessarily think like I'm writing a book that's in this particular genre. I definitely think like, okay, here's how I can use these elements of whatever the genre is, and like definitely of, you know, suspense or of my first book, I was sort of writing about fairy tales, but it's never, you know, I don't think I consider it like literary fiction. And I think that people who pick it up expecting sort of, you know, a flat out horror novel or a flat out, it's like in divorce fiction for some reason.
We had a conversation about it, and we're going. So I'm curious how it ended up there, but I wasn't entirely sure whether that was a conscious choice you made or if the publisher went, well, there's a way we can shoehorn it, and it's a small category. We can get a higher number if we shove it in there.
Maybe they're the ones who are the brains behind how to market it.
Like, I just write the book. You guys figured that part out.
Yeah, and I mean, I honestly think it's a book where like it's probably best to go in cold and have, you know, no real expectations other than to know, you know, like if you're going to be triggered by postpartum depression,
right?
Not a book for you.
Yeah, but other than that, I think we were having the conversation as we go along, like, okay, now I feel it's more this. Well, now I feel it's more that. So I'm waiting for her to finish so I can go, okay, now tell me what you think. Because
I know, because I went from this is horror to this isn't horror at all. It's literary psychological fiction.
And it's also kind of historical fiction.
Also, like LGBTQ fiction. Like it's like there's a lot of things. There's also like a Latin test we could take afterwards, and like word origins.
I thought you meant Latin as in like Latin America.
Oh, like the samba.
No, you mean okay. For those who haven't read the book, there are these series, and I'm assuming, since I listened to it, so I'm assuming written out, it was pieces of the main character Megan's thesis that she's working on and setting aside. So it'll have these descriptions of these words, and it's like this word from the Latin for this, like hotel is also from the same word as hospital, and guest and ghost, and all these things. And going, I don't know if any of this is true, but I like it.
Oh, it's all true.
I like it.
I would have let you get away with it even if it wasn't. Like, all these words are related.
I know. I was so excited. I use one Latin word in my current work in progress, and I do define it. And I was like, I'm so original. And then I was reading yours, and I'm like, no, I'm not original at all.
I felt like for this book particularly, I think because I was writing, so the book it's about Margaret Wise Brown and her personal life, but it's also about her professional life. And professionally, she sort of came up in this tradition of progressive early childhood education and these new books that were being written for children. And it was sort of like if you were to take, you know, like James Joyce or Gertrude Stein and write it for children is sort of what they were doing. They were saying like, let's basically like write modernist literature for kids where it's about like the physical present moment and you're much more like situated in space and it's about the physical experience. And so that's why you get things like a fire truck goes beep, beep, as opposed to before like the 1930s when books for kids were either there just were no books for kids or it would be like a fairy tale. And so I felt like, one, it was a lot of fun to sort of look at the roots of these words, and it said a lot about this character who is trying to tether herself to something as she becomes progressively, you know, more and more unwound. But also it tied in my mind, to this idea of, you know, Margaret Wise Brown and how carefully she chose the words in her books. You know, like it's not just like, oh, she came across this nice idea about a book to say goodnight to things. You know, like a lot of kids' books say goodnight to things. It's not like she just said, you know, let's draw pictures of bunnies, kids like bunnies. Like she was every word was so carefully chosen. And they went, you know, she like combed over the manuscripts, and it was, you know, it's art, it's literature in the same way that writing for adults is art and literature, which is another part of the book is like, did she feel like it was art and literature? And in her day, sort of, was she respected for what she was doing? And the answer is sort of. But I was really interested because she herself, like the historical Margaret Wise Brown, was very self-deprecating about, you know, I just write books for kids, but like these aren't just any books for kids. These are sort of the seminal books for children, and they're poems, really. So all this to say, the etymology was, you know, my attempt to sort of get that conversation going as well.
Well, and I was going to say one of the later things that happens, there's it's not a spoiler or anything, but there's a conversation where they almost focus group one of the books, and one of the children points out, that's not the kind of noise a car makes. It sounds like this. And then they change it to actually capture what a child's experience with these noises. So it's not even just like we're talking down to these kids, but we are actually seeing them as these are our audience members. These are our intended readers. What would they perceive? And let's have our book reflect that. But what you brought up about the self-deprecating and whether she thought what she was doing mattered, that part just really hit home for me, because you have this whole second storyline about Margaret and Michael like constantly putting her down about, you just write books for kids. You know, when are you going to write a grown-up story? When are you going to do this? And we've had conversations many times about which genres are looked down upon, or if you're just writing for children. And I just wish we could get just everybody now and back then over the whole idea of, well, you only do this or you only do that. Just embrace what you do. And if you do it well, let's applaud that, versus go, well, you aren't writing literary, so that's just, it's commercial, or genre, go away. That kind of thing. It's just the elitism.
It goes to show, because Michael Strange, who was Margaret's partner, the one who was telling her, you know, you only write books for kids, do something serious. Nobody knows who she is. She was a poet. She sort of had a sort of the equivalent of a podcast back in her day. She had a studio program. And she like was a playwright, but nobody knows her except in the context of Margaret Wise Brown. And there's like one or two. She's married to John Barrymore, so that also, she was like, he was her second husband, and she was his third one. I don't know. So, you know, it's not even like the, you know, romantic interest. But yeah, so when you look at whose work has stuck around, and how they're being read today, it makes it even sadder, you know. But it also feels very like, okay, well, if in this moment somebody, you know, like I just wrote a book about, like you said, like mesh panties for postpartum women. Like there are people who are like, this is not serious, you know, but it is to me, it is to all of us who, you know, have experienced that, and those who haven't should take it seriously. But more importantly, like what somebody says about it today isn't a reflection on what sort of how it will go down in history, depending on, you know, you know, the implication of my book is going to go down in history, but I think you know what I mean. And I think your
point of
genre, you can apply that to children's writing, and you just don't know what's going to resonate and how people are going to be impacted. And so I think, you know, it's short-sighted to say that, you know, there's like one arbiter of what is important in writing.
Right, because her stuff stood the test of time, and you can ask around, even Jen, who's like, I don't even have kids, and I read this book.
Yep.
This is something that was known, and it was funny because as I was reading your book, and it does start with the story of Michael just a little bit there before getting into Megan and the present day. I had never heard of her, and it wasn't until The Goodnight Moon came up that I'm going, oh wait, these are real people. I thought they were fictional until that came around, and I went, oh, I wonder if they're all real. And then, of course, I fell down the same rabbit hole Jen did because I had no idea. I mean, I knew the name Barrymore, and I figured, okay, well, I'm assuming then if you're using them accurately, historically, but they didn't stand the test of time. I mean, the Barrymore family did, but Michael Strange really didn't, and Goodnight Moon did.
Yeah.
Trisha, do you have any questions?
I do, actually. This story is just it's so gripping, and it's almost like they blend so well, but it's like two separate parts because there's the part about Margaret and everything else. And it almost gives you a break from the story. It's almost like you're getting so drawn in, and then here's this break to kind of give you. And also, it's kind of a two-part question because your first book, What Should Be Wild, and you even said it was like fairy tale-ish, which is very different from this book. How do you do that? Especially, two separate, two books that are completely different. And then you have this one book that has very different parts in it that do blend well together. Do you write one part out separately? Do you write one part, then the next part? What's your process for that?
What did I do? So I wrote the present day stuff. Not all of it, but the majority of it first. That was sort of where I started. But I realized fairly soon, within the first 100 pages of writing about Megan, two things that I realized. One was that it was so claustrophobic to be in her head the whole time. And it was so intense that it wasn't, unless I only wanted to write a 100-page book, I was going to need to take some space, and like there's just going to have to be some breathing room in order for it to work and for it to resonate and sort of do what I wanted it to do. And I also realized that if I was writing about sort of Megan's relationship to Margaret Wise Brown, I was going to have to show the reader who Margaret Wise Brown was, and I was going to have to figure out a way to sort of get all of that backstory and all of that exposition sort of into the reader's mind so that then they could go and see what I was trying to do later on in the book. And so I hit upon, it took a while. I sort of was playing back and forth with how I was going to do it. Would it be sort of her just sort of flat out saying, this is my research for 3 chapters? Would it be, actual letters from, Margaret to Michael and vice versa, which I have a few excerpts there, but that ended up just being epigraphs. And I finally realized like having Megan's dissertation, which is about Margaret, was the solution because it let me jump, it provided those breaks so that it wasn't just all sort of psychosis all the time. And it also gave all that exposition, and I could just, because it's not a real dissertation, I could just sort of cut it off when it started to get boring. And so I could give like just the details that the reader needs. Highlights. And then I could just stop and I could jump to the next thing. And it provided, it also ended up, and this wasn't as conscious, but retrospectively, I think it also shows you sort of who Megan was before she had a baby, which is
what I was going to say.
She's so, because so much of what's happening is she's trying to figure out who she is now that she has a kid. And I always knew I wanted to start it like right in the hospital. The baby's born, the book starts. And so this was a way to sort of cheat almost and show, what her life was before she was a mother.
And you also do that when she's reflecting on where her cohort is. So these other people, what life she stepped away from to have this baby and the reflection there. And I thought that was really interesting because I find a lot of us do that where we look at people who started in the same place and then things go differently. And I mean, not a spoiler because it's very early on in the book that the baby wasn't a planned baby, that this wasn't one they weren't trying for, but it wasn't like she made the conscious decision to do this. And so this has disrupted her life. It wasn't like, well, this is a good time for us to start a family. It was like, well, I guess we're doing this now. All right. and also the idea of, oh, well, I'm going to take the maternity break and then this is going to work out and I'm going to be able to do all this writing and then how that didn't end up working for her, I thought was just, again, very much life echoing art and probably back and forth, where you have this idea about, oh, well, I will put the baby down to nap and I'm going to write. And it's not reality, especially when you are completely sleep deprived, and the idea of having a coherent thought at all, let alone something in a dissertation, is like, really? You want me to do what? No, we're not doing that now.
Yeah, I really like the juxtaposition of how you wrote both parts, because like the present day parts are so visceral, and it's so fast paced, and you're in there in her head the entire time, that it just like, I feel it, I smell it, I smell that apartment, I smell like the sour milk and the spit up, and then to go to that very academic style of writing, it's a welcome break when it happens.
Yes,
I'm just like,
yes,
oh,
yeah. I mean, I think there's the possibility that nobody has written sort of immediate postpartum book before, because like people don't really want to read it. People don't want to sit in it. Not that they don't want to read it, it's that it's difficult to sit. It's hard enough to sort of experience it, and I think especially watching somebody struggle, and watching as, she doesn't really, it's not like, oh, she struggles and someone comes to help her. It's sort of like she just continues to flail around, and you just watch her as it gets progressively more difficult, and she sort of burns any bridge toward help. So yeah, I think having the book not just be that was really important.
I mean, she's a very hard character to love sometimes, but you do love her.
Oh, I'm glad. I love her.
I
have so many. I mean, people say like, well, how there are just none of these characters are likable, and I like all of them. So
every book I've ever written, people have said none of your characters are likable. And I wrote a book about a woman whose baby died right after she gave birth, and I spent a whole book in her head slowly going crazy. And people are like, this is a downer. I'm like,
yeah,
it was supposed to be.
Yeah.
I'm like, yeah.
Pretty sure the title was kind of a clue there, like From Daylight to Madness. That wasn't going to be a, hey, feel good right now. Probably not. It could be.
So do you read your reviews?
Oh, yeah.
Oh, that's great.
Even the Goodreads
for my first book, I'm no longer like reading everything for my first book, which came out 3 years ago. But especially early on, just to get, especially now when I have no other human contact, it would be different. It probably wouldn't be different, but sort of my justification is, like I can't go to the bookstore and talk to somebody about this, but I can see what they say. I mean, my agent sort of says like, don't do that all the time. And I tell myself not to, but I do feel too, though, with this book in particular, I think there are enough people who are really getting it and really responding to it that it makes it easier when somebody just isn't connecting or is not into reading about this particular topic. But yeah, and I read them, and I definitely, the bad ones I remember forever, and the good ones I'll forget immediately. So as
yes, I can like quote verbatim most of my bad reviews, and then I'm like, but I think a bunch of people liked it, didn't they?
I know.
Well, I wanted to ask, just going between the two books, was there any kind of, I don't know what the style was for you, if they were both written at the same time as far as one contract and then you were contracted for the next book, or if they were pitched separately. I'm just curious how much pressure there was on you to make them similar as far as being able to shop them as, look, it's the next one from this author you loved, when they are, as you said, very different books.
So yeah, I wrote them and sold them totally separately, but I did sell them to the same publisher and editor. But for me, it worked out nicely. I mean, I didn't have a second book when I sold the first one, and I didn't really have even, like any sort of momentum toward one. And so it was really freeing, I think, to then be able to just write whatever I wanted to write. And I think because I think that a lot of the things that my editor at Harper responded to in the first book were also present in the second. Like there's a lot of sort of thematic similarities, and I think people who enjoyed the first one will probably also respond well to the second, but they are really different. And the pressure for me came from the fact that I had had a baby. I had, my son was 1 when my first book published, and that meant that I had written most of it before he was born. And I felt sort of this, like Megan, this pressure that if I sat back for too long and if I didn't do the next thing, I would lose my footing in this world, which is a little bit silly because writing is one of the things you can do, or if you do take that step back, you're okay. You know, like you can get back in a lot more easily than if you are on track to be the manager at, wherever it is that you're working, and then you step away, they're not going to just pop you back into that same position, And so I think women especially face that. And right now, with the pandemic are really facing that. So I was lucky in that regard, but I still had this internal pressure of, I want to firmly cement myself in this world and not just have this be a fluke. And so I think that's what propelled the book in a way that having a contract, I think, might not even have sort of pushed me.
That's very inspiring.
So was the first book that you published, was that the first book that you queried then, or did you have other books that you queried first?
Yeah, it was the first book that I queried. It was not the first book that I wrote, but it was the first book that I wrote that was worth showing anyone. I had tried, and I was in the middle. My first book was my thesis for my MFA, and I had come into the MFA with this other book that I thought I would be the book that I sort of came out of the program with. And I just sort of started for some class this other thing, and everyone said, no, this is so much more interesting.
The other thing, work on this.
But it was valuable in that I was sort of navigating how to write a book. I think one of the things that can be really discouraging for newer writers is this idea that like you can't, maybe some people can, but for me, I couldn't just jump in and do it immediately. Like I needed to have a project that didn't work first, because it's so different. Like writing a novel is just really different from anything else I had ever done. And I think to be able to sort of play around with it and say, okay, well now I know, how, I can't even tell you exactly like the tangible things that I learned, but I learned a lot from that book. And I was able then to write a book that was so much stronger and that I was ready to, look for an agent with.
Well, definitely. And I know that whole idea of, they talk about that practice book, and I've heard some authors say, oh, you've got this many bad words in you, you got to get them out of the way first. And then the joke is, well, do the things I worked as a lawyer, do those count as some of the bad words, or does it have to be short stories and all that
can it be all my journals and all the poetry I wrote when I was in high school? Can it be some of the bad words?
Poetry that I sort of flushed.
You have to get them out before the good words can start formulating themselves. But it's interesting because I don't know, are you working on something else right now and you've got little ones underfoot, or do you have
I'm very, very slowly working. And then I'm hopeful. It just, like today was a 55-degree day in Chicago and the sun is out and people are getting vaccinated. And so it feels closer than ever to be able to work on it, but I really have not done. My daughter is 8 months old and my son is almost 4. And we really have not had childcare. We pulled him out of school last March and never put him back in. And so it's been a lot of parenting. And so I'm ready to sort of like carve out my time again.
And be able to go to a coffee shop and write somewhere.
No.
Jen's just saying that to torture me.
I can't go. I'm like, I don't go anywhere.
So I know, not to say that if I didn't have kids, I think it's silly to think that anyone, some people are, but I would imagine that everybody is dealing with their own form of something right now.
But most of us got out of the house more, and we're all trapped in our own little pods, and all of our pods look slightly different. So, whether you were like, well, now I'm trapped with this person I married and it's just the two of us, okay. Or in my case, there's 3 little people plus the husband, and we're all cramming for space and Wi-Fi connection so that we can all do what we need to do. It is not ideal working conditions. It's not ideal creativity conditions. So I hear you on that, on trying to do that, and having an 8-month-old. I'm trying to do the math going. So the baby was born just shortly after we went into quarantine, pandemic baby.
The baby was born at the end of June. So pretty early into it.
Yeah.
You're like 6
All
months pregnant and then the world.
Wow. It was not a fun time. It was not a fun time to be pregnant.
I can't
imagine that.
I mean, that's
having
a horror novel, right?
Yeah, no, I was going to say having it depends on what kind of support you have, but having a baby and then they joke like, okay, you have a baby and another baby. It's like you're drowning and then they hand you another baby. And doing that, and then you wouldn't have been able to have people come by and kind of tag you out because you're just shut down the whole time.
Yeah, it was. I mean, we really didn't have. Luckily, my husband has been working from home also since last March, and so having him, having a set of hands there was great. And he had really good paternity leave, which again, like parental leave is super important. Maybe, hopefully, you read this book and you think like, oh, hey.
The dad should be there.
Paternal leave, maternal leave, all that.
Yeah, I was lucky, and I also felt it's funny. The systems that I didn't have in place when my son was born, in terms of just like the emotional support systems, I did have for my daughter. So like there weren't. We couldn't go places physically, but I now had other friends with kids, and I knew what to expect. And so I
googled that because of
their first babies during the pandemic. I just can't. It's just everything sort of that I wrote about times a million. So I was very lucky in that it was my second.
Well, and I was giggling when you said the what to expect, because that message board, that's one of the other tropes that you have, because that was one of the things I love the most, because I was on some of those boards, but only with my first, because by the time the second one came, I'm like, I figured enough of this out. You guys don't know any more than I do. Let's move on. But just that idea that when you are the first one in your group, or there's nobody kind of close to you that you can ask these things, that you're literally asking strangers who are also just as clueless. Does this discharge look right? Is this right? And it's just like weird show up on there. So I love that you incorporated that, because that also really cemented it as to this time, because I know that if you had kids 20 years ago, they didn't have those kind of message boards. So on one hand, that's a cool thing that we have now, but on the other hand, it's kind of like, hey, a bunch of crazy people who are all talking to each other about the same crazy stuff. Maybe it's not the best thing. And then how some of the messages came through. It's like, where are those messages coming from? Those seem less legitimate than some of the other messages might have been.
Oh, ladies, I hate to cut us short, but we are out of time.
Well, thank you.
No, I'm making a pouty face for the people who are not. Making a pouty face. Thank you, Julia, for coming on the show. Thank you, Vox Vomitus Vixens, as always, for just being here and being amazing with great questions. Thank you to Roman Sorotin, our producer, and Pam Stack, our executive producer. Thank you to everybody at the Global Authors on the Air Network. This has been a copywritten podcast. Stay tuned next week. Next Wednesday, we have Sarah Langan on Vox Vomitus. So next Wednesday, 6 p.m. Eastern, 3 p.m. Pacific. And we will see you all then. Thank you.